This is the Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today I'm here with Bentley Adams, CEO and founder of Way. Way is an intuitive eating app that helps people find peace in their relationships with food and their body. Bentley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Hall. Good to be here.
So where does this podcast find you?
I'm in Los Angeles right now, actually. Yeah, home base.
Okay. Well, tell us more about your background. What did you do before this?
Yeah, so my journey really started in college, especially around health. My professor told me that 2/3 of people in this country were going to live a life of pain and suffering due to preventable chronic conditions. And that just stopped me dead in my tracks. I'm an Eagle Scout. I took an oath to do a duty to this country at a very young age. And as sappy as that might sound, or as messy as things are like they are right now, I always took that seriously. So when I heard that, I knew, and since then have known, what I want to do with my professional life is to impact health. And so my first love actually was in body movement and functional movement, helping people move in alignment with their natural structures, and seeing that when they did, they report back being happier and better to their spouse, their partner, their friends, their coworkers, the strangers on the street. And so I had actually wanted to be a doctor, and my mentor in college, who was a doctor and an Olympic athlete trainer, said, don't do it. It's not what you think it's going to be. You're going to have to care for people the way that the system wants you to, not the way that you want to. So I still went about my mission naively thinking I could go to the healthcare system and learn it from the inside and make change that way. So started at KPMG, audited Medicaid for the state of California, then went to Beckman Coulter, which then moved me into sales, ended up running New York at a young age, being number one in the US at a young age, and then realized that corporate healthcare really wasn't going to be the way to make impact on health. And so of all things, my neighbor was a principal at a venture capital firm that was riding pretty high called Accretive, and they had built a company called Fandango that we all know for movie tickets. And they had exited it and built another company called Accretive Health, which at the time was one of only 36 companies in the world that was privately held and worth more than $1 billion. And now, obviously, we know over the last 12 years, that's gone up considerably to over 1,200 companies. And so that are what we call now unicorns. And so they had wanted to take that model and put it into laboratory, which is where I had domain expertise. So I became the fourth member of the founding team of that. It grew very, very fast, was successful, ended up selling to private equity. But before that, I had gone into building the next thing, realizing that the vision for me with the lab company is that if we can impact the laboratory of the healthcare system, we'll inspire, in the wake of the Affordable Care Act, we'll inspire other departments of the healthcare system to do the same thing, thus freeing up capital and freeing up people, freeing up resources to tackle the big problem, which is prevention. And so it definitely made a dent in the lab industry that really shifted the way the lab industry operates, and still to this day. But I had moved on to build the next company, which is a digital marketing agency that was focused in the consumerization of healthcare. So we had clients like One Medical, Healthline.com, MedHelp.org, Life Technology, Secretome, Trobogene, ResMed, et cetera. It was an Inc. 500 company, but didn't make a dent. And so for me, it came back to, how do we actually impact health? And there was this thing that I had known since studying the human body in college and ever since, that nutrition is the single biggest factor to each person's overall health. And that's not really debated by pretty much every scientist, doctor, trainer, dietitian, anyone who studies the human body. So that's really how I got into it. And then, happy to give the background on actually how we got from that observation to what Way is now. But I'll pause there because that's a pretty solid background, I think.
Well, it sounds like you had a great journey there. Well, so tell us more about starting a business in the area of health and wellness. What's that like?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of the businesses in health and wellness are independent. They're independently owned and operated. And so that's always an option. If you have a skill set, if you're passionate about helping people one-on-one, there's always going to be people that are looking to get better. And that's the beautiful thing that you see on the ground in health and wellness. If you want to start something that's a product, something that can scale to potentially hundreds of thousands, millions, or tens of millions of people, I think that the kind of prevailing wisdom would say that it's very difficult because it's very noisy. I think that the reality is that if you do your homework and you have a really strong why, that you really figure out how to find that differentiation that can help people en masse and make significant impact. And so I think that the biggest experience point, I think, from this has been, yes, it's the navigation of what to do and the scope of what to do is hard. But once you get there, it's the impact and the reward are significantly higher than they would be in other spaces, I think.
Great. So what's the opportunity here in the health and wellness space? What are you finding is the potential?
Yeah, I think it's a massive potential. We're at a very interesting point where consumers, I think the healthcare system has not caught up to the consumer market, which we have to remember consumer spending is 70% of our GDP in this country, 20% is healthcare and 10% is everything else. And there's a massive rejection amongst the Gen Z and millennial generations of restrictive diets. And that's because of their failure. They've watched their parents fail on them for years. They're suffering from the self-esteem, suffering from the physical health, the mental health aspects of it. And so I think that shift is one that the healthcare system hasn't really recognized. And they're starting to get some recognition of nutrition broadly. Doctors are not trained in nutrition. They have one class maybe during med school in nutrition. And so I think that Dean Ornish has done a great job of starting to, a famous, very well-known, former doctor of multiple presidents, has said, he's done an amazing job working on longevity through nutrition and educating from the inside doctors on really what's incumbent upon them, which is to become more knowledgeable about nutrition and nutrition behavior. And so I think that that's really where the opportunities of the future really lie. It's how do we figure out how to take this pent up consumer rejection of an existing paradigm and then figure out how to make it the mainstream, put the form factor around it, and then make it a really the going forward culture that will create more health, more happiness for people in our country and everywhere.
Great. And so what's the challenge in starting a business in this space?
Yeah, I think the challenges are plenty. I think there's generally challenges. I think the Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours to learn a new subject and become a master of it. I think that most people I find who are successful at building businesses that are sustainable, and especially in the software products world, they really have already had that 10,000 hours or multiple times that. So if you go into a space, make sure it's one that you have some knowledge about, and also more importantly, a big why. What's your reason for doing it? Go through that exercise before you get into it. But I think that's general. I think specific to our space, it's that there are a lot of people that are working on different things. There's a lot of different incentives that are happening from different angles that are happening in the consumer market, and there's a lot of noise. And so it's important to make sure that you have something that is iron forged before you try to scale, to get that differentiation clear in the mind of the customer, and make sure that it smells different, it looks different, it feels different as soon as they look at it. That's the real challenge.
So what's the potential reward? For example, how much are companies selling for in this space?
Yeah. So I think the valuations of the companies in the space are, you can look at like the Whoops of the world as an analogous spaces, but they're more device heavy. If you look at like a MyFitnessPal or a MapMyFitness, those were two of the bigger exits, 8-9 years ago. I think MyFitnessPal sold in 2015 and MapMyFitness in 2013. And then there was Rise that sold in 2016 as well. And so the exit values, most of them are not public, but kind of what we gather is that they're actually very, high relative to what a lot of the peers would be. So like if you're B2B SaaS, if you're looking at a 6X, that's kind of average. I think in this space, we're looking more like 10, 12 is pretty common, and as high as 20. And so I think that that's where if there's a good quality business with that differentiation, the opportunity is significantly high.
Great. And so what are the differences between Whey and Whey's competitors? What sets you apart?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's the number one question we get, which is, how is it different from Noom, right? And so I think what Noom has done a brilliant job of is they've done a brilliant job of marketing around the stop dieting. I think they've actually proved that the message stop dieting is something that consumers have a huge appetite for. But underneath the hood, we all know, and dietitians and mental health experts have a huge issue with Noom because it's ultimately a green, yellow, red system. And so they're putting different foods into green, yellow, or red based on caloric density, and then telling you what categories you should eat in, which are effectively another version of Weight Watchers, right? And so that's really effectively a point system, and that becomes a restrictive diet. And therefore, we know restrictive diets fail 83% of the time or more, some studies as high as 95, 97% of the time. And that's really where almost everything is focused in that area, including in Noom as well. When you go into a Noom, for example, they'll say, how much do you want to lose? You're at 190 pounds. You want to get to 165 pounds, or you're at 150 pounds. You want to get to 110 pounds in 3 months or in 6 months, whatever you tell them time-wise, they'll say, eat 1,200 calories a day, which anyone who studies the human body knows that's going to be that barely beats the basal metabolic rate. And so what we do is fundamentally different because we never get into restriction. Way is based around helping people uncover and reveal what they already know in order to start to learn how to listen to their body and make sustainable change. So intuitive eating as a modality has 150 clinical studies behind it. And those prove its longevity, or if you will, long term, it has a better performance for changing eating behavior. And ultimately, I don't like it, but the studies are based around weight and weight loss and maintaining weight loss for a long time. And so separate from that, we're also working within the cognitive behavioral therapy model. So thoughts lead to emotions and feelings that lead to behaviors that reinforce the thoughts. And then asking people a very specific question, which is called a miracle or magic wand question, that's used in dialectic behavioral therapy and addiction therapy. But it basically asks, imagine finding peace in your relationship with food and your body. What would that feel like? What would that look like? What would you be doing? Or what would you be eating? How would you feel about your body? And when that picture gets in someone's mind, the thoughts and emotions and feelings start mapping to that picture. And when that happens, the behaviors start mapping to it. And so that's why with whey versus like a restrictive diet that has maybe on the high end 17% success rate, we've had 73.5% of users notice that they're thinking differently about how they eat, or they're actually eating differently at the grocery store or restaurant in the first week, which is extremely high. And that's why, is because we're shifting behavior based around helping somebody understand and make their own decision versus being told what to do. And telling somebody what to do never works long term. It very rarely does. So that's the main differentiation. Basically, everything else in the market that resembles a restrictive diet struggles, and those that are focused on more of an intuitive eating, listening to the body approach, I think are the ones that will have long-term success.
Great. And so what's your advice for those who want to enter this space as a company or an investor? What do you tell them before they join?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the company side, I've advised, I'm a rising tide floats all boats kind of person. And so I've advised a lot of companies in the space, and analogous to it. I think that the number one thing comes back to what's the end point of what your benefit is, what you're delivering, and making sure that the way that you get there and what it is fundamentally non-triggering to people. Because what we find is diet culture is the consumer response to a restrictive diet or anything that looks, sounds, or smells like a restrictive diet. It's an immediate aversion. We found this in blind user testing and in user interviews we have for, a long time now. And so what we see is that making sure that it doesn't trigger people's failures from the past, and that it's something that actually is sustainable. And so that's the hard part. It's really easy to, I just built a new food tracker that does this other thing, this other way. But food trackers are synonymous with calorie counting, which are synonymous with restrictive diets and this kind of diet weight loss mentality that causes a lot of pain and suffering. Again, we go back to it. The reason why 1 out of 4 people who do a restrictive diet will develop an eating disorder. That's a very high percentage of people. And then another 35% of people will develop some sort of disordered eating pattern. So if you do a restrictive diet, 6 out of 10 times, you're going to develop either an eating disorder or disordered eating. And so the idea is, and there are a lot of experts that say that that's a low end. And so we know this is the big thing that consumers, whether they're conscious of it or unconscious of it, they're actually responding to, is that they just have a huge aversion to it. So that's what I really advise, is make sure that it's not in that space, because that is the old way and it's going away. Consumers are done with the restrictive diets. It's just a matter of, will it take 2 years or 5 years or 10 years before the mainstream culture is fundamentally shifted?
Great. So what online information source do you find most helpful in your work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's funny because it sounds very generic. And I apologize to the doctors who are listening in, because they can't stand it when a patient says, I found something on Google. But when I was building the agency, what I found is that Pew Research Institute had a study that said 77% of all online health searches start at the search engine. And that's an important data point for us to know. And so for me, what I do, my number one focus is, what do people see? What do our customers see? What do our potential customers see? And where are they going? They're going to Google. So if I can think of what the avenue that they come in, and having been a Google partner before, I'm also looking at what are they seeing, so that I can understand their relative user experience of solutions and messaging and that sort of thing. And that's really what's gathering out. But the other area that I look in is going to the intuitive eating dietitians and people who are non-diet trainers. There's all these sorts of people that are understanding the way to help people heal their relationship with food and their body. that's, I think, really, those are really good sources. But there are a couple other ones on the mental health side, but those are, I think, that's kind of where I go. And it's mostly seeing what are people seeing in Google. And then also too, as a resource for myself, I like to dig into studies. PubMed, Mayo Clinic does a great job. Cleveland Clinic does a great job. Behavior science stuff as well. But I, gather lots of different places. I think Andrew Huberman of all things has some really interesting things out of Stanford, and BJ Fogg out of Stanford Behavioral Lab. I'm a big fan of, because I think what they've done, BJ Fogg especially, has basically galvanized behavior path, or a behavior observation that we've known about for thousands of years, but people don't put into practice. And I guess the last one on that now that I think about it, is one that I've kind of bedrock to me, is Robert Waldinger in the Harvard study on adult development, which is the longest longitudinal study done on humans that's ever been recorded. And so basically the net conclusion of the first cohort, which they've now updated the cohorts and added more people in to expand the study, but is that the single best predictor of our health and happiness is not all these health metrics and everything that we want to look and put into our Apple Watch and that sort of thing. It's actually the quality of relationships that we have with other people. And so the updating that he's doing on the data of what they're finding of why around ultimately when we have poor relationships with other people, or lack of relationships with other people, we're in isolation, creates chronic inflammation, chronic stress inflammation. And that's actually, we know inflammation is the source of over half of the known diseases that develop. And so within the healthcare system. And so it's very interesting to see that these old, as he says, this is not new wisdom. This is as old as the woods, is that the relationships that you have are hugely impactful to your health. We're all tied to each other, whether we like it or not. And so the question is just, what do you do with those relationships? And where I kind of plug from the end of what Wei does is that I've taken that wisdom and say, well, the two longest relationships that you have are the relationship with food and your body. Before you even knew you were eating food, you had to eat food. Before you even knew you had a body, and your body is actually, I'll go back to, I'm on like the very here and now. What I'm deep into is the book Power versus Force by David Hawkins. And he wrote the book Orthomolecular Psychiatry with Linus Pauling, who's the only person to win 2 Nobel Peace Prizes. But that concept that the body already knows everything is such an important concept. And so the relationship with the body is such an important concept. So bit of a tangent, went down a rabbit hole there, but I think it's super important. And that's really where I find to get those resources, more regularly. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's very insightful. I know when you start a business, you have to make choices and you have to focus in on it. If you hadn't started Wei, what business would you have started?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. It's very interesting, because I think that my entire life path, this is my life purpose. And I feel like everything has led me to doing this. So I don't really have in my mind another business that I would have started. But I think looking back, it's hard looking. I think hypotheticals in retrospect are really hard, because what you find is that you're operating from the information that you have now. Like, of course, right now it would have been great to start a chat GPT or something like that, but it took $1.2 billion in 8 years with no revenue for them to do that. I think that for me, given my personality, I probably would have started something that would have been more or less in an analogous space, but more me actually doing interpersonal work. That's really the thing that has always given me a lot of reward. And that was the original reward for me that got me inspired into working in health to begin with, combined with the statistics. But I always love helping somebody on a one-on-one basis, creating that emotional rapport, creating that safe connection, that trust, and then helping them through effectively mirroring their neuromuscular patterns, helping them see what they're doing so they can make their own decisions and make long-term change. That's really powerful to me. I think that that's where some amazing things happen, and seeing how their whole life changes because of it. It's really, it's about as deep of a reward as a person, that I've felt, or at least on the professional side.
Great. Well, when you started Wei, what's one thing your business did that you didn't expect?
Yeah. Actually, the thing that I didn't expect is that, like, within a month of starting Wei, we had the editors, the nutrition editors from Healthline reached out to us via social media and wrote organically a full feature on Wei. And that was something that I've only seen very advanced companies get that sort of organic press. And so to me, that was actually really indicative of what they see at their lofty level of being the biggest health site on the internet. They saw that, oh, wow, this is finally a product that's doing something about a space that they've been following for a long time. And so with their, 100 million monthly visitors or whatever the number is, they can see that there's a huge need here. And so I thought that was the thing. I just didn't expect that to happen. I thought, we're going to have to grow. We're going to have to, pound the sand, beat the street, just keep going and going and going. And we still are. But I think that was pretty surprising. And I think that's like more kind of external thing that happened. But I guess the internal part is how important it is to create the picture in somebody's mind that's non-triggering from a form factor, like what we've done with the product. We just released 2.0 last month, and it includes the peace point, and that is kind of the central part of way. And so I think that's been the surprising part as well. So I didn't think that was going to be, it was buried in the app experience before, and now it's like the central theme of the entire experience.
Great. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here today, what else should we cover that we haven't?
Good question. I think that we've covered a lot. I feel like we have, but yeah, I think that it's mostly just kind of what we're focused on in the future, and the vision that we have for the future is one where restrictive diets don't really exist. That instead of people talking about the restrictive diets at the water cooler or wherever they're at work that have failed them and created shame and guilt and that sort of thing, our vision for the future is one where people listen to their bodies and they know what their body is saying, and they feel like they can talk about that with each other. And I think I'm very encouraged that that's the future because of the destigmatization of mental health and therapy that we've been living in, which has been fantastic. I think that improvement we'll see in the next 10 years, the benefit that it's given to all of us by having that. And I think that the future that we live in really has to be one where restrictive diets in the consumer market don't exist. And that's really what we're focused on, and everything that we do is geared towards making that the case.
Well, that's good. That's good. Well, so how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Yeah, email. I think the other ways, obviously, I think there'll probably be some of my details on the site that people can look at. hello@eatmyway.com is one email they can use. And then our Instagram, I think, is actually the best way for people to learn a little bit more and to reach us, as well as our website. So our website's www.eatmyway.com. And then our Instagram handle is eatmyway app. So people are able to just follow there, check things out, reach out to our social media team and find me there as well if they'd like. And always happy to have any good conversations or things that can further the mission and the vision.
Great. We'll put those in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Hall. Thanks for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Hall T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.